Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The Indiana legislature is in its short session, its emergency legislation session, when it's going to deal with only those matters left over from the last budget session, but we know that's not quite the case. It's open season anytime the legislature meets. This being a particularly important election year, it's become particularly political. Today we'll discuss the Indiana legislative session of 1988 and what it's going to mean to Hoosiers in terms of public policy and perhaps in terms of the election. Our guests are Roger Jessup, State Senator, Republican from Fairmount, whose 20th district represents most of Grant and northern Madison County. Ray Sheely from the Political Science Department at Ball State University. And John Rouse, our executive producer and a member of the political science faculty here at Ball State. Roger, if there's a big issue being battled, being fought out now in the legislature, it might be over highway funding. The governor seems to have lost a battle in the House, but he's certainly not given up the war. Where are we headed in terms of a gasoline tax hike and more money for roads?
Well, I think as that comes to the Senate, it will be given serious consideration. As you know, because of the bonding, it failed in the House. The Senate, I think, will not only be considering that, but they'll be considering other options. My survey in my district showed that the people are all in favor of better highways, but they'd like for someone else to pay for them, and which isn't unusual. But generally, people favor truck taxes, and I think there will probably be a weight distance tax to replace the $29 million that was lost when the court ruled that the decal was unconstitutional, I guess.
The gasoline tax hike seemed to scare off some people in election year as well.
Historically, that's been true. Back when I was the chairman of the Senate Roads and Transportation, we attempted to raise gasoline taxes, and it passed the Senate and generally would fail in the House. But there isn't any such thing as a free lunch, and someone has to pay the bill. And if we do provide better and safer roads for the people in the state, we're going to have to find increased revenues. The real problem is that today's automobiles are much more efficient. 10 years ago, when revenue collections for highways were greater than they are today, the average car only got, or many automobiles only got 12 or 13 miles to the gallon. And now then they're nearly double that. And then statistics show that the trucks actually do the major damage to the highways, and they have an increasing share of the burden in the cost of that.
Senator, it seems to, in a sense, that this highway bill or the highway appropriations appear to be pure political pork. Is that an unfair way to characterize the highway spending?
Well, of course, I really don't think that that's fair, because I had a project canceled in my district, the bypass in Marion, Indiana. Senator Boris, the chairman of finance, had one canceled in his district, and projects were put on hold all over the state. Actually, we have in the planning about $400 million in highway construction projects, and we have about $4 million to react to that. So you see, we aren't even in the ballpark. And that was one of the propositions, or one of the reasons why the proposition for a $300 million bond issue was proposed. I think if we suddenly raised that much money, we couldn't spend it in this year or the next year. But perhaps if we do get $50 million to react to the problem, it will be a major start and something to build on. And if the increase in the truck taxes raise approximately $25 million, I think there are other options where we can raise an additional $25 million, whether it's a shift in the general fund, some general fund monies, or whether we would have a one-time increase of a few cents per gallon or a surtax in order to get some of the projects underway and completed.
There have been some real concerns about the infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges. Are we really going to need to look at bonding as at least a short-term cure? Obviously, bonding is not necessarily a short-term cure because you're paying for it a long time, but as a cure for some immediate infrastructure problems?
That is one option. Of course, there are many problems with bonding that if bonding puts into place a structure that requires maintenance, then if you have to pay the bonds off in the future, how do you maintain the expanded system? For instance, when I was chairman of roads, I was in contact with Pennsylvania, and at that particular year in the middle 70s, when Pennsylvania paid off the interest on their bonds, they didn't have a dime left to maintain their highways. And I certainly wouldn't want to see Indiana get into that position. And any bonding that we have, I'm sure, would be on a short-term pay-as-you-go basis. They've proposed a 1 cent increase to pay for the interest on the bonds.
Ray, I want you to talk for a minute about why these Democrats are politicizing the legislature this year. The Republican leadership's talking about how Democrats, because they see a chance to win the governor's seat this year, have decided to make this political heyday in the legislature. Is that is there a real basis for that kind of criticism?
Well, I remember going back when Governor Bowen was still governor. This was following, I think, the 1976 election. We had a major highway bill then. And I remember Governor Bowen, of course, we had a split control then. The Democrats, as I recall, were in control of the state Senate for that 2-year period, and the Republicans were in control of the House. And I remember Governor Bowen's statement on a highway bill is it had to be a bipartisan bill. I mean, obviously, Governor Bowen recognizing the split legislature he was facing. It seems to me that what hasn't emerged here on highway funding is a bipartisan effort. In looking at the votes down there, obviously the Democrat caucus had a position on that bill over on the House side. All but one Democrat voted against that bill. And then there were a few Republicans that joined to make the 55 votes against it on the House floor. In a short session, Roger, I'd be interested in your thought here. It seems to me with the House almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, it's going to have to be a bipartisan bill to get it through the House side.
Ray, I think that's absolutely correct. And especially if a measure is distasteful like most tax measures or all tax measures are, then it takes bipartisan support. One party is very reluctant to pass a tax measure solely with their caucus votes and get all of the blame for raising taxes. And I think that this was especially true last session when we raised taxes to meet the needs for the education bill and excellence in education. We did have bipartisan support, and if the public, then they tend to accept that much better.
So, since both of you gentlemen represent various political parties from time to time, let me give another perspective. Aren't we undertaxed? I mean, shouldn't we have more taxes for things like education and health? Number one, on education, we have to meet the future, and we have to have a viable way of meeting the future. Number two, in terms of health, a crucial issue, especially with AIDS coming on and that kind of concern, isn't this state really undertaxed? And shouldn't our politicians really be going out to the public and saying, hey, we need for you to raise taxes?
Are you directing that to Ray?
Well, yeah, let me reflect a little bit upon that. We've had a lot of tax increases at the state level in the last 8 years. Okay, in the 1982 special session, and that was not a bipartisan tax increase, by the way, but the emergency that befell the state in terms of the shortfall of revenues, we passed taxes. It didn't appear to have much of a political consequence in the following election years. We also raised taxes this very last year for education, to fund the education bill. That was, as you indicated, a bipartisan effort, or members of both parties voted for it. What we almost do, it seems to me, in Indiana, as long as I've been watching public policy, is major policy areas get their turn at the trough, so to speak. We've had education now, and we funded it to a large extent. Well, we raised taxes for education last year. Other items on the agenda appear once in a while in the legislature. This time, roads. It's their turn at the trough. Now, the question is whether or not the trough is going to have any money in it. Because, again, it comes down to that neither party, and particularly individual legislators, don't want to be held, pointed at as the person that raises taxes. Change can come to Indiana, and tax increases do happen. But there has to be that consensus that builds, and it has to be the turn or the time for that particular issue to be funded, it seems to me.
Well, Ray, I think you've given it a rather good perspective. I'd just merely say to John that I haven't had the first constituent come to me and say, we need to have our taxes raised. And even the local people, you know, we allow certain local option taxes, but they would like for us to be the goat and raise the taxes so that they can spend the money. But we have increased taxes to meet some of the very critical needs, and the public has accepted those. But this being an election year, and the public reaction to the surveys indicate that there have been sufficient tax increases, and they're not very enthusiastic about raising taxes even for highways.
But this highway bill is something of a two-edged sword. I mean, there are a lot of projects that legislators can go back to their communities and say, with this new money we have, whether it be bonding, whether it be a gasoline tax increase, we'll be able to complete, for example, in Delaware County, the 2 lanes on Indiana 332, so you have your 4-lane access to I-69. On that end, it's a good political bill for legislators, isn't it?
If they can see the visibility before the election, it could have that effect. Actually, we have spent considerable highway dollars and put money from the general fund into highways where it involved economic development. To have sufficient access to the GM plant in Fort Wayne, for instance, this is true both locally and at the state level for the new Subaru Japanese plant near Lafayette, Indiana. And we do need a good infrastructure, of which surface transportation is a viable part, if we are to have economic development and compete with other states and compete in the foreign market.
I think the only point I would make about advocating more taxes, and since I'm not running for office, I can always advocate more taxes, is that the public tends to want services, and they want quality services, but they don't want to pay for it. We especially look at our national picture where we have a tremendous deficit, and our society wants to provide these things for people, but really at the bottom line is that somebody has to pay for it. And in a sense, I'm looking for leadership out of our legislature, out of our executive, to come to the people and say, hey, we have to be honest and we have to look these issues in the eye. Perhaps we might even think in terms of real changing our society to switch from highways to public transportation again, in some sort of mode of public transportation. They're even coming to that in parts of California, in any case.
You do have people, Roger, though they don't come to you and say, raise my taxes, they do say, build me a new road or improve the education or pay teachers more or help us with this program. There are those people that want to spend the money, aren't there?
Oh, there's always people spending, and I served on Ways and Means in the House and Finance in the Senate, and I've never had any agency or any entity, whether it's Ball State University or an institution, come to before the committee and say, you gave me too much money last time, you don't need to give me any more, or you can even reduce it. It's usually more money. And having to do with taxes, someone is quipped, of course we're interested in fair, equitable taxes that don't seriously impact one segment of the economy and cripple that economy. And the general public's perception, the good tax is the kind the other guy pays. And
Roger, I think that's a good point. I never have had a student come to me and say, hey, you've been too fair to me. I should have had a B instead of an A. So, well, let me get off this. And I mean, because it seems to me that what the public perceives here oftentimes is a lot of politics with this highway legislation. But is there anything else going on down there we should know
I
about?
think there are many issues, and we've spoken to. For instance, we passed an AIDS bill, which is one of the serious problems confronting our society at this particular time. It wasn't as extensive as some would like, but I think that the voluntary testing, premarital testing, does have merit. And the health people tell us there's some flaws in the test because many of the first tests show positive when actually the person is not carrying the HIV virus. And you can imagine the trauma and the shock to think that you have a terminal disease when it actually you do not have. But it's a public social problem that we do have to react to, and that we especially need to educate the public of the seriousness of the problem, how it is transmitted, and the ways that it is transmitted, try to exercise some control there.
we talked about raising taxes for education last year. There's also an attempt this year to modify the A-plus program that Governor Orr's taking credit for from the last session, that there are proposed changes and, matter of fact, have come through the House at this point. Are we going to see some, or are they needed? Are there changes needed in this year-old program?
Well, we knew at the time when we passed the A-plus program, and I've always been a promoter of education, having the educational background, and favor excellence in education, although I did happen to vote against the education bill because of the tax increase. And the tax increase that was in that bill, even beyond education, was one of the reasons that I didn't think that that much tax increase was necessary. But the A-plus program is a rather magnanimous program, and implementation isn't easy, and it does require some refinement. Overall, it's a very good program and will help to improve education in the state of Indiana. I think you referred to the bill that passed the Senate having to do with the allowing 2 days count toward the total of 180 for parent-teacher conferences. And of course the governor is very much opposed to that. He is interested in contact time with the student and maintaining 180 days of contact time with the teacher-student contact, if that's at all possible. And I suspect if that reaches his desk, why, he will veto the bill. But
well, you have a background in education. How do you feel about dedicating a couple of those days for parent-teacher conferences?
I did vote for the bill because I think that that's very important. If you don't have the student properly programmed and oriented, and you don't have the contact with the teacher, then you're starting very much of a disadvantage for the student in school. This is very important, although I think that we could add on guidance counselor time over and beyond the 180 days and do it more cheaply than to have 2 extra full days of school. It costs something like $11 or $12 million a day for every day of school we have in Indiana. But we could bring in the guidance counselors ahead of time like we do with administrators and have parent-teacher conferences and provide the proper counseling and program for the students.
Senator, if I could keep you on this question, and since Ray's been active in terms of state politics, state superintendent for public instruction, I would think that we're not doing enough in this country, and especially in this state, especially if you look at other countries on the issue of education, that we really have to ask more of ourselves on this issue as far as trying to spend the money appropriately. You've been active in terms of the education committees. Ray's been active. Don't you think that we're not doing enough in Indiana, that there should be more focus upon accountability? You know, how do we come to a mix in terms of what do we get out of education, and how do we arrive at this very difficult solution?
Did you care to react to that first, Ray?
Well, let me give you, these are personal observations, and certainly I haven't been in the position as legislators have been to actually do something about the problem. Outside of teaching classes, I try to do something. I think the problem with education, from a social theory point of view, is that it's over-institutionalized. It's been an institution around since the early 19th century, okay, when we started funding public schools. Consequently, there's a whole host of groups of people that have got a chunk of that institution, if you will, in terms of public policy. And we found it, and we know when we over-institutionalize anything, it tends to get like arthritis and hardening of the arteries, and pretty soon it just slows down, and it's no longer productive. There's no longer creative forces at work. I would say that some of that's to be blamed upon the teachers' associations of the state, that quite frankly, going back to a point the senator made, they come to the committees and all they want is more money. That's been the theory for 2 generations in Indiana. But we also have school board associations. We have a whole host of different associations around the educational establishment that also take that same institutionalized approach. I think we can expect a lot more out of our children in the classrooms. I think we can challenge them. But I don't think in this present environment we're going to do it without some real strong and I would contend courageous leadership. I think we're starting to see that, primarily because people are so highly dissatisfied with the public school system. What I'm afraid of is that on this A Plus program that passed, is that we're going to start shunting education again to the back burner, when as a matter of fact all the surveys I see, it still registers #1 in the public's mind in terms of an issue. We're moving roads up, we're moving all of the other things up which are not in the public's mind as #1 to tackle. But in order to do that, we got to break some of the old, long-standing bonds around this educational establishment in order to make some progress. Now, that's from a very theoretical point of
Senator,
view.
you have?
Well, philosophically, Ray, I don't think that we're very far apart. My thinking on our public education, that we should develop the students' individual ability to the fullest that we possibly can at the time they exit the educational system, whether that's before grade 12 or at grade 12 or even into higher education. And really, if we compare our educational system with the other systems of the world, which some of the studies indicate, and the spokesman for the Carnegie Institute that just completed a study a little over a year ago said that the U.S. schools should have no less than an A-, if not an A. And I think it's significant that it's our educational system in the United States that has given the world all of the high technology that it has, almost without exception. And the Japanese have copied it, used it in industry, and brought it home to work against us. In our educational system, I think that education gets blamed for a lot of the problems of society. And we have a changing scene in our social structure. It's very difficult to motivate the students at risk, and we have more students at risk today than we've ever had before, coming from the single-parent homes and almost no-parent homes. And this is the importance of the parent-teacher conference. It's very hard to motivate a student to work up to their optimum if there isn't help at home. And it's a problem that we have to deal with, and it's very difficult for an educational institution to have the kind of cooperation from a home, especially if there are two parents working or only one parent and they're not there much of the time, in order to get that student to perform at the level he needs to perform at if we're really going to be competitive internationally and in society today.
You know, I think what both of you are saying, if you think of a pastor or a church or head of a corporation or the head of the family, they're saying, hey, this is for somebody else to take care of. I mean, for example, are you saying in a sense that the leaders of corporations, private corporations, sometimes might say, well, this belongs to the university education, or it belongs to the school system? Are you saying in a sense that that education is not just for the educational institutions, it's for everybody to be concerned about, regardless of what institution in society?
I think that is true. And education in America is not only for business and industry and to make an individual more efficient to produce for the economy and the productivity of the country like it largely is in Japan, but we have a different system of government, and we need that individual to be informed in a broad-based education so that he can perform well in a democracy and make decisions if we continue to have a government by the people that is effective.
On the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned the students at risk. They're the gifted and talented students, high school students in Indiana. The Ball State proposes to put an academy on the Ball State campus here, where juniors and seniors who are particularly gifted or talented from throughout Indiana would be brought together on this campus in a setting that would perhaps accelerate their learning and find that potential you talk about. Is that a good philosophy, or is that not a good one?
Well, I think that program certainly has merit, because many times we have students with superior ability because they aren't motivated or because the home environment isn't what it should be. They tend to fall through the cracks. We may lose them, and then later they find and they come back, but many of them do not. Even some of the criminal records show that these are people who were uninterested because the environment wasn't what their ability, expectations could produce. And it certainly does have merit. You know, we have one of the best higher education systems in the world, but we want to make sure that we get all of the people there that should be there.
Is the legislature ready to do something like that? Yeah, I mean, it's been in the
well, I understand that
years.
Bill is moving to fund the academy here at Ball State, and I would predict that it will pass.
Will we get the funding this year, or are we going to have to wait till next year?
Well, it depends. Our revenue forecasts are down beginning the first of the year. 1988 hasn't been as encouraging as the last quarter of 1987, but hopefully there will be sufficient funding there.
If there was one other thing you wanted the legislature to do during this session, can you think what it might be? If one bill that might be sitting back or pending for waiting action now, is there anything you'd like to see the legislature do that it might not be doing?
Well, of course, I have bills of my own, but really, in the legislature, we have to prioritize and react and fund the issues that are the most critical, whether that's in education, whether it's in highways, corrections, mental health, and there are many considerations. And we do need improvement in many areas, but we have to prioritize and sort out those that are the most critical.
Do you see a real, as I mentioned earlier in the program, do you see a real politicizing of the process this year, particularly since Democrats seem to have at least a perception of a chance of winning the governor's seat?
Probably this session is a little more political than some I've served in the past, but all sessions are political. And of course that isn't bad, because if we believe in the two-party system, the minority has to have a check rein on the majority to make sure that they're kept honest.
Senator, we were talking before the program that Republicans have been essentially successful in this state because they're pragmatic as opposed to being ideological. Do you think that's going to continue? Or are there any particular ideological programs that the
Boy, I wish we had time to answer that question. We're out of time. I'm sorry. We'll save that question for the next time we have a legislative wrap-up. Thanks to our panelists, Ray Shealy, Senator Roger Jessup, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Mike Seaborg, Bill Mosier, Nancy Carlson, and Steve Johnson. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.